Greed is one of the so-called 7 deadly sins. It takes its place with wrath, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony as being at the root of other sinful behaviors in the Christian life. This list of sins had its origin in the early church period and was especially emphasized in the medieval church. Greed, the Latin term is avarita, is also related to our English words avarice or covetousness. It is a sin of excess. It is going beyond the limits, desiring more than we should. It is often linked to desires for wealth, status, and power. Thomas Aquinas wrote that greed was a sin against God, just as all mortal sins, inasmuch as man condemns things eternal for the sake of temporal things. In the Roman Catholic tradition, the antidote or remedy for this deadly sin is charity, a loving giving which counters the sinful desire to have, which is the essence of greed. In our Reformed theological tradition, there is a strong emphasis on human sin. This sin is pervasive through all life and affects every area or dimension of our lives. This sin disrupts or breaks our fellowship and relationship with God. At its core, it has to do with living life our way instead of God's way, seeking what we want for ourselves instead of what God wants for us. To live from the center of life, when that center is our desires, cuts us off from the kind of life God intends, which is for us to live in trust, dependence, and obedience on God, and to serve God in the ways God wants instead of the ways we want. Our Reformed tradition recognizes God gives good gifts to us to use. John Calvin emphasized this. We have Christian freedom, the freedom under God to use the good gifts we receive from God's hand. So, Calvin says, we have never been forbidden to laugh or to be filled or to join new possessions to old or ancestral ones, or to delight in musical harmony, or to drink wine. True indeed, says Calvin. What God does not want us to do, however, is to abuse God's good gifts, and by our lusts to use these gifts only for ourselves and to have no regard for weaker brothers and sisters. Calvin said, "There is almost no one whose resources permit him to be extravagant who does not delight in lavish and ostentatious banquets, bodily apparel, and domestic architecture, who does not wish to outstrip his neighbors in all sorts of elegance, who does not wonderfully flatter himself in his opulence." And all these things are defended under the pretext of Christian freedom. They say that these things are indifferent. I admit it, provided they are used indifferently. But when they are coveted too greedily, when they are proudly boasted of, when they are lavishly squandered, things that were of themselves otherwise lawful are certainly defiled by these vices. So it is the inordinate or excessive use of God's good gifts that stems from the sinful heart and is expressed in greed, which is what is to be avoided, and indeed what is sinful in the sight of God. So Calvin continued, "But where there is plenty, to wallow in delights, to gorge oneself, to intoxicate mind, and hear with pleasant pleasures, and always to be panting after new ones, such are very far removed from a lawful use of God's gifts." This was illustrated in Calvin's comments about a famous verse in the book of Amos, where the prophet is condemning the complacent, self-indulgent people who are at ease in Zion and feel secure on Mount Samaria. The prophet cries, "Alas for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall." Calvin notes that the prophet says first that they slept on ivory beds. To use ivory beds was not in itself bad, he said, except that excess is ever to be condemned. For when we give up ourselves to pomps and pleasures, we certainly are not then free from sin. Indeed, every desire for present things which exceeds moderation is ever justly reprehensible. And when people greedily seek pleasure and display, or become ambitious and proud, or are given to delicacies, they are guilty of vices ever condemned by God.